How are we all? I just basically thought it would be a good idea maybe to, when we're going through some of the revision on the poets, for me to kind of read out some of the notes. It might help a little bit. So I'm not going to read out the whole of the poems, but because you can read them yourself. But we're going to kind of move on to Robert Frost. And the first one I'm going to kind of go through the notes with is Out Out by Robert Frost. So Out Out by Robert Frost. Basically the title, we're going to start with the title, is a reference from the Shakespearean text Macbeth. And in Macbeth there's a line that's like, out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow. And this speech in Macbeth is basically a comment on life and how life is kind of fleeting, meaningless, kind of short. So it's this kind of idea that life is something that's fleeting, and this is reflected in the poem Out Out. So it makes the kind of reader think about the similarities and differences between, you know, the lives of, you know, a young country boy, which is, you know, in Out Out, and then like the life of a king, like in Macbeth. How, you know, their life experience for both of these people is very different. So lines 1 to 9, the first section of the poem sets the scene. So that with lots of Robert Frost's poems, there's lots of elements of rural beauty. So it's all about like nature, and he kind of basically presents like rural life as idyllic, and how things in the countryside are always, you know, nice and very kind of beautiful. And then urban kind of imagery he predicts as kind of like negative and dark. And we see this kind of contrast, this juxtaposition in this poem, so I'll explain that now. So at the, you know, from lines 1 to 9, there's a view of the mountain ranges in Vermont. He describes the smell of wood. But the dominant element in the scene is the buzzsaw. So where it's like a real contrast when the saw is like portrayed as kind of an animal, and it's very kind of industrial, very aggressive. This is contrasted really like a lot with the beautiful mountain ranges he describes, the smell of the wood. So there's lots of then like active verbs there that describe the saw at the very start. So snarled and rattled, that's kind of repeated throughout the whole poem, that the buzzsaw snarled and rattled. And this is personification. So this is a really, really important poetic device, poetic technique. And it's called personification, and it's when a like human like a personality, human behavior is put onto an inanimate object. So an inanimate object like the buzzsaw. So it's kind of portrayed as a bit of an animal, a wild animal that can't be controlled. So then lines 8 to 9, you know, the only people that it mentions that isn't the boy is that like those lifted eyes. So you're not really sure who they are, but it's kind of, we assume that they're very busy, they're other workers going about their kind of like routine day. And it says here like nothing happened, you know, nothing out of the ordinary. So it's very kind of like an everyday. He sets the scene that it's a very normal day, very boring day, nothing kind of crazy happening, just people working. It's just a normal day. Lines 10 to 18, we see the boy who's, you know, operating the buzzsaw. He's working, and then we see his sister as well, who's also working. So there's this kind of elements brought in, and it's child kind of labor, you know, children working. Today it's not kind of normal, but back then it was normal in rural Vermont, rural America. During that time, it was kind of normal for children to work on, particularly in rural areas on the farm. So we see these children doing adult work. So it kind of tells us that this is a working class family, it's a poor family. The adults aren't really mentioned. They're referred to as they and them. So they're kind of like these shadowy figures. We only kind of see the children's point of view here. In lines 10 to 18, the accident happens as well. So this is the accident where the saw cuts into the boy's hand. If the saw was active at the beginning, it now seems to kind of conscious. So the saw is kind of brought to life almost, in a malevolent way. So there's a line here, the saw, as if to prove the saw knew what supper meant. So when the child kind of calls for supper, the buzzsaw kind of snaps up, and it's like it knows what's happening. The buzzsaw is kind of personified. So again, this is another example of personification, really important. And I leapt out of the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. And this last phrase, keeps the intentions ambiguous. Frost kind of encourages the reader can interpret that how they want. And there's this kind of idea that it's kind of predestined, so bear with me here. Frost puts in this line that the buzzsaw the buzzsaw didn't refuse the meeting, and that the boy must have given his hand. Now, this is a bit kind of theoretical and it's a bit out there, but it's this idea that it's called kind of malign providence, and Frost is kind of here suggesting that the boy was meant to cut off his hand, that it was something that was predestined, predetermined, kind of like fate, like it's something that the boy in the saw didn't have control over. It's predestined. And this is the view of Frost, and Frost kind of has this idea, it's called malign providence, and he has this idea through a lot of his poetry. And he had it, through his bouts of depression, because Robert Frost suffered with depression throughout his life, and he toyed with this idea that sometimes bad things were bound to happen to people, and it was kind of all part of a design, like God's plan kind of thing. And he sees this idea again in design. So in his other poem, Design, we see that idea. So that's called malign providence, and it's this idea that something bad was predestined. So lines 19 to 27, we see the reaction to the accident. So the boy's rueful laugh, as it says, it suggests an almost humorous, ironic acceptance of what has happened. So he has actually laughs after he cuts his hand. Very strange reaction, but it's kind of a gesture that's very kind of futile, and it's kind of like a humorous, strange kind of reaction to what's happened. And he holds up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. So he holds up his hand, so people around him can see, but also that to stop kind of the life spilling out of him. Really kind of graphic imagery there that grabs the reader's attention, and that's what Robert Frost does very well. He always wants to grab the attention of the reader. So he'll have this like really nice natural imagery, but he then juxtaposes it, contrasts it with some really brutal imagery, and it's usually kind of the brutal imagery is to do with kind of industrial images, work, this kind of stuff. So he really loves to contrast the idyllic nature, and then the kind of brutal industrial side of things. So the next moment is crucial. Then the boy saw all, and that is the most important line in the poem, in my opinion. The boy saw all. So what did he see? So the boy saw that his life was kind of over, and this is a very kind of bleak kind of outlook, but it's a very bleak and very pessimistic poem. Back then, there wasn't any sort of social welfare for kind of workers who were injured or anything like that. Particularly for a working class person, if they were not able to work, their life was extremely difficult, and there wasn't a kind of social welfare system that boy could then go back to. He was going to starve. He was going to have a very, very bad life, if he wasn't able to work and kind of provide for himself. And we see that then, that the boy saw all. He saw this kind of thing happening. He saw his life kind of end in front of him, basically, the rest of his life. So he said he's old enough to know all this and understand the significance of his accident. He saw all spoiled. This knows that without two good hands, he is limited in the work he can do the rest of his life. And that's why he appeals hopelessly to his sister not to let the doctor cut off his hand, because he knows he needs this hand. So he starts begging his sister not to let the doctor get the hand, because he knows just how amazingly important it is for the rest of his life. He needs it for his future. So and then we see the finality of this with the line, the hand was gone already. So we know it's gone. We know it's kind of everything's lost for him. Very bleak, very pessimistic. The poem moves rapidly to its bleak conclusion. The boy is anesthetized, and then something horrifying and unexpected happens. So if we think things can't get any worse, they do get worse. Frost refers oddly to the watcher at his pulse, and this might well be the doctor, but it could be the father or mother or another. It's very kind of, it doesn't say for certain in this kind of mystery, the unknown. gives a kind of, a daunting kind of atmosphere, a bit of a kind of menacing atmosphere. The watcher, like, it's very bleak, you're not too sure who it is. It gives a very kind of menacing atmosphere to the poem. It's deliberately left obscure. So again, this faceless they, so it's talking about the they a lot. We don't know who's referring to. Again, that brings a very kind of like unknowing atmosphere. Listen to his heart, but in one line it is all over. Little, less, nothing, and then that ended it. So little, less, nothing. The pulse on his wrist, drops and drops and drops until there's nothing there. It means obviously he's dead. Very, very bleak end to the poem. So the boy in the injury is died from shock, and this is actually a true story. When Robert Frost was growing up, I think it's in the farm next to where he grew up. This event actually happened. The final two lines are perhaps the most chilling in the poem. They're the most thought-provoking anyway. No more to build on there might refer to the boy's heartbeat, but it's also about his role on the farm. He cannot be part of its future as a worker or even as the future owner. And as for they, when it's referred to the others, the adults who are still alive, they have affairs to get on with. So it's that last line that's very kind of thought-provoking, because they were not the one dead, they turned to their affairs. So it's very kind of, you can interpret that lots of different ways. It's very bleak, very pessimistic. And how do you interpret that? Basically, it's kind of the economic reality of people back then, that you can say they were uncaring, that they were kind of cruel to kind of walk away, or that they knew they still had work to do that day and they had to do it, and it reflects the kind of economic reality. So there's different ways to there's definitely different ways to interpret that end bit, and that's kind of the beauty of this poem. And in a question for the Leaving Cert, you add your own voice to that, you say your own opinions to that end bit, because it's very important, very thought-provoking stuff. There's no sentimentality at the end of that, and there's no acknowledgement kind of his work. So there's another theme there I just want to talk about. There's a related theme, is the threat that mechanization poses to rural life. Back then, it was a transition on farms from, it was basically a transition from workers doing the work to the machines doing the work, and this is something that put some people out of work. Operating machines on farms wasn't always popular then, so it's this thing that the threat of mechanization on farms posed to rural life, that farms didn't have to hire as many people if they could just have a machine to do it. So the buzzsaw is a central character in this theme and with this idea, and the buzzsaw does the terrible damage that's depicted in the poem. So machines like this were relatively new on New England farms when the poem was written. So you could see the saw as a kind of villain, and it obviously cuts off the boy's hand and kills the boy. But it's this kind of added allegory, this added kind of metaphor, that is the saw the villain that's going to destroy rural life in America. And it's destroying kind of rural harmony as well as it destroyed the boy's life. So there's that added little extra metaphor there. And then I explained that thing about the malign providence, the predestined idea, that there's this idea that it was always bound to happen. And Frost really takes that idea forward in his poem Design, so if you have time you can read through that. In just a little brief about the form and language, written in blank verse, has lots of freedom regarding meter, so there's no real there's a few lines that are iambic pentameter, there's kind of dum rhythm, but very few. Particularly the line that comes up a few times, and the saw snarled and rattled. This cannot be read in the strict iambic pentameter, so it can't be read the dum, and because of that, the lines kind of around that line, it's a bit odd. It sticks out a little bit, and it's suggested sometimes that this is kind of describing the behavior of the saw, that he can't be controlled. It's very wild, very crazy. It's not a natural rhythm that the saw has. So when he describes the mountain ranges, that's more of a dum natural rhythm. When he's describing the industrial imagery, it's kind of wilder meter in the poem. The speaker is not personalized either. He tells a story in kind of he just tells a narrative telling a story. There's a strong sense of the person speaking, even in there's fragmented sentences. So which says, but the hand, that's line 18, so line 27, and then that's line 30. These are kind of expressions we use when we're telling a story. So there's this sense of like dramatic telling a story. So there's a voice behind the poem. It's a story being told. The language contains nothing really fanciful, except the portrait of the buzzsaw is very kind of like dramatic. Very interesting thing that I think is very interesting about this poem is that there's no emotions are described. So there's no emotions described in the poem. It's very sinister, I think. The adults are always kept at a distance. There's never any emotion described about the boy, about his feelings or what they feel. There's no human feelings in it. It's all very kind of mechanical when it comes to the saw. And I think that's very sinister and it's very interesting. There's a lot of alliteration in the poem, assonance, and onomatopoeia, and obviously personification. So there's loads of stuff going on there in terms of poetic techniques. You can definitely figure them out yourself, read through it. There's assonance in saw and all. There's that kind of elongated aw sound. The repetition of the s's and the I sounds. 3 consecutive stresses on the long vowels. That the words the man kind of slow down the rhythm. So that those kind of sounds, they slow down the rhythm, and that happens just before the action is about to take place. So there's a rhythm to the poem at that point, and it slows it down. And that's just before the kind of crucial part of the poem starts. So that's Out by Robert Frost. Hopefully this video is a little bit helpful. So obviously you're supposed to be kind of reading through the poem. This is on page 219 of the poetry book. While I'm explaining it, you just can listen to me explain it while you're reading through it yourself. I'm going to do this for a few Robert Frost poems, and hopefully it's of some help. I was toying with the idea of doing a Zoom meeting, but I think people's schedules might not match up, so I think me just presenting something on a YouTube video and then you reading through it in your own time, it's a better system. But I'm open to any suggestions. If you want to do a Zoom meeting, we can do that, but I think this is probably a better way of doing it for people. So Out by Robert Frost tells a tragic story, the contrast between beautiful setting and tragic incident. It conveys the harshness of country life, of rural life, of working class life in America, focuses on children. There's a detached kind of tone in the person telling the story, disturbing final lines, and this really makes readers respond differently. So whenever you're writing about this poem, definitely throw in your own voice, your own opinions. In terms of leaving certain questions, Robert Frost, in the past when he's come up, they've asked about how everyday experiences are kind of mentioned in his poems, and they've also asked about his natural imagery. So they're kind of things to kind of think about, and they're all what a lot of his poems deal with. So hopefully this was of some help. I'm going to make a few more of these with Robert Frost and maybe continue on for some of the other poems. So hopefully you're all keeping well, and I'll see you soon.